It must have been close to 6 when I found myself walking through Radcliffe Square with no clear reason for being awake, let alone outdoors. There are mornings in Oxford when the air carries the texture of an unwritten poem, and this was one of them, thin light struggling through a low grey, the kind that makes even the stones seem to wait for something. I had slept badly, troubled by one of those uneasy dreams where nothing happens, yet everything feels intrusive. A faint echo of it clung to me as I crossed toward All Souls, the cold seeping through my coat with familiar indifference. What I remember most is the silence, not the ordinary hush of early Oxford, but a sharper stillness, as though the Quadrangle had drawn a breath and forgotten to let it go. I stepped beneath the arch and felt the soft grit of old flagstones give a half-hearted reply to my footfall. And there, on the bench along the eastern wall, I saw a porcelain teacup, white with a faded ring of blue about its rim, sitting untouched against the waking morning. Steam rose from it in a thin, wavering thread, the kind of detail one notices only when alone, or when some hidden corner of the mind is already alert to strangeness. I moved closer cautiously, though I could hardly have said why, and felt the faint warmth lingering in the air above it. Someone had been there minutes before. Someone who had sat in the quiet of the Quadrangle at dawn, drinking tea and then leaving, without haste or ceremony, as if the world had no claim on their departure. I told myself it was nothing. Oxford thrives on small eccentricities, a fellow seeking solitude, a postgraduate escaping the suffocation of hallways, a cleaner taking a moment before returning to her duties. And yet the sight unsettled me in a way I refused at the time to examine. It is often the smallest things, a misplaced glass, a line misquoted, a door left ajar by a thoughtful hand that later proves intolerably heavy with meaning. I left it where it was and walked out through the same archway, hearing behind me the faint drip of water from a gutter still swollen from the night's rain. The city was stirring by the time I reached St. Giles, vans unloading bread, bicycles cutting uncertain trajectories through the damp light. I bought a newspaper I barely read and made my way to the station where the day, in all its inviolate ordinariness, seemed determined to begin. By the time I reached the office, Lewis was already there, looking as though he had slept better than I had, but was trying politely not to show it. He mentioned in that steady, undisturbed voice of his that a lecturer from All Souls had failed to appear for his morning session, a historian, Adrian Mallory, well regarded if not universally liked. No one was yet calling it a disappearance, but the porters were uneasy. Mallory was punctual, meticulous, and disinclined to sudden changes of plan. Lewis asked if I'd been near the college that morning, and I found myself thinking absurdly of the teacup. I told him I had walked past, nothing more. It seemed premature to trouble the air with possibilities that had not yet learned to stand upright. There was a brief discussion with Strange, who approached the matter with his usual mixture of suspicion and tedious caution. Missing academics, he remarked, were usually found asleep in armchairs or on trains bound for the wrong direction. Experience has given him faith in banal outcomes. I envy that faith more than I would admit. Lewis and I left the office an hour later, the morning light sharpening a little as we turned onto Holywell. The pavements gleamed with last night's rain, carrying that faint mineral scent I've always associated with the first week of Michaelmas. Students hurried past us, already late. Somewhere a church bell miscounted the hour, its uncertain toll echoing across the rooftops like a reminder of something forgotten. As we approached All Souls again, my eyes returned involuntarily, unwelcomingly to the bench along the eastern wall. The teacup was still there. Steam gone, a small, cooling remnant of someone else's private moment, left in the open like a question. Lewis followed my gaze. He asked if something was the matter, and I told him no. Yet even as we walked toward the porter's lodge, the image of that cooling cup remained with me, a quiet shape in the corner of my mind. waiting for the rest of the story to catch up with it. I've learned over the years that certain details arrive early, like shy heralds to darker truths. I did not know then how faithfully this one would return. It was Lewis who first voiced the concern that had been quietly forming in the back of my mind since dawn, though he did not realize it. Mallory's absence, he remarked while we crossed the grey stones toward All Souls, felt strangely deliberate. Not the oversight of a forgetful man, but the pause of someone who had been interrupted between intention and action. Something in his phrasing struck me with the faint discomfort of déjà vu, as if I had heard similar words spoken long ago in another case, whose edges I preferred not to revisit for reasons I never fully understood. Then either. We found the porter, waiting with that mixture of caution and faint pride particular to college staff who sense that something unusual has occurred but are unwilling to be accused of exaggeration. He led us through Mallory's staircase, the air thick with the odor of old plaster and a hint of tobacco that must have seeped into the walls over decades. Mallory's rooms were neat in a way that suggested not tidiness, but habit, a life composed of carefully repeated gestures. Books lay open, yet aligned, as though conversation had been paused mid-thought, awaiting a speaker who would not return to this place ever. On Mallory's desk lay a half-completed translation from Latin, the ink still sharp enough to imply recent effort. I traced the lines with a fingertip, noting the faint indentation where the nib had halted, as though his attention had been seized by something just outside the frame of ordinary life. Beside it sat a crossword, mostly filled, except for a single clue in the upper corner. A deceptively simple one, the sort Mallory enjoyed a 5-letter word hinting at an untrustworthy ally. The blank square felt oddly intimate, like a sentence awaiting confession, waiting for the hesitant truth he never managed to write there. Lewis wandered to the bookshelves, scanning titles with that gentle curiosity of his that often elicited truths more effectively than my own impatience. He murmured something about Mallory's preference for marginalia, pointing out a volume of Donne whose annotations revealed a restless mind, teasing harmony from contradiction. One note in the margin caught my eye, a correction of a misattributed line, executed with almost tender irritation. It was the kind of detail one forgets noticing until later, when its significance returns with unwelcome clarity. Mallory, whatever else he may have been, was not careless and certainly not inclined to abandon tasks without reason today. The warden arrived with that measured tread particular to senior academics, accustomed to being obeyed even when they pretend otherwise. His expression hovered between concern and irritation, as though Mallory's disappearance were both a puzzle and an inconvenience. He offered a few polished remarks about Mallory's brilliance, his unpredictability, his tendency to disappear into archives for days at a time. Yet something in the warden's manner felt rehearsed, like a man reciting an anecdote he scarcely believes. I watched his eyes drift toward the desk, linger on the crossword, then shift away too quickly for any innocent observer to overlook without second thoughts stirring. When we stepped back into the corridor, Lewis asked whether I believed the warden. I answered in the evasive manner that often substitutes for certainty in our line of work. What mattered more, I suggested, was the intersection between Mallory's unfinished tasks and the quiet gap left by his absence. The crossword clue returned to me then, nudging at some half-formed intuition, a 5-letter treachery waiting in plain sight. Perhaps it meant nothing, but Oxford has a way of wrapping its truths in modest disguises, trusting that only the persistent will strip away the outer layer to reveal what hides beneath its cautious surfaces. As we stepped outside, the quadrangle held the same muted stillness I'd felt at dawn. My gaze drifted, uninvited, to the bench where the abandoned teacup had cooled. It remained there, unchanged except for the absence of warmth, as though patiently rehearsing a silent testimony. Lewis followed my stare but said nothing, perhaps sensing that my thoughts had wandered where explanation would only diminish them. I wondered, not for the last time, whether Mallory had paused there before, vanishing, or if someone else had lingered in that early hush, leaving behind a quiet trace of motive that would surface later in our inquiry. Perhaps inevitably. The Bodleian always carried for me the peculiar sensation of entering a place that remembered more than it cared to confess. That morning, as Lewis and I climbed the narrow staircase toward the upper reading room, I felt the faint shiver that came from the scent of parchment, the pale chill sliding across glass, and the slow groan of the floorboards beneath our weight. It was a place that preferred whispers to speech, and perhaps that suited what waited for us there. Dr. Eleanor Reeves sat at one of the long wooden tables, though sat is not quite the right word. She seemed arranged there, poised with the quiet elegance of a woman who had fought hard for stillness and meant to defend it. A thin shaft of weak morning light fell across her notebook, revealing a tight script that suggested an impatient intelligence. She looked up with the faint irritation of someone whose concentration had been prized open without permission. She knew why we had come, of course. Everyone in All Souls knew by then. Rumors travel through colleges with the undignified speed of smoke escaping from a badly tended hearth. Reeves closed her notebook, not sharply, but with a kind of resigned precision. She told us she had been there since early morning, preparing material for a forthcoming lecture on 17th century political anxieties. Her tone was calm, but her fingers, resting lightly on the table, betrayed a subtle tension, a quick contraction, a soft release, the smallest flutter of unease. I asked about Mallory, in the way one asks about a colleague whose absence is troubling but not yet tragic. She answered quickly, too quickly perhaps, that she had not seen him in several days. Their last conversation, she said, concerned a misinterpretation in his forthcoming monograph. The correction had irritated him. She paused, as though considering whether to elaborate, and then added that such disagreements were common and hardly worth reporting. But the brief shadow that crossed her eyes told a different story, fragile and only half buried. As she spoke, I found my gaze drifting toward a tall stack of reference volumes beside her. One lay open to a page recording the college's archival loans, a neat column of names, dates, and signatures. Mallory's name appeared there, but with a sharp line drawn through it, an erasure too clean to be careless. Reeves saw where my attention rested, and for a moment I sensed her weighing the impulse to explain against the impulse to conceal. She chose neither, offering instead a silent steadiness that revealed nothing but the cost of maintaining poise. Lewis wandered to the window, murmuring something about the rain-softened quad, but I scarcely heard him. It was Reeves's timing that nudged at me the way her claim of arriving before first light did not sit, comfortably with the porter's recollection that the reading room door had remained locked until nearly 7. A small inconsistency, light enough to ignore but heavy enough to linger in the corner of the mind like a line from an unfinished poem. When we left her table, she returned to her notes with a composure that felt almost defensive. The faint scratch of her pen followed us toward the far shelves, a sound that was steadier than her earlier nervous fingers. I paused again near the loan ledger, drawn back to the crossed-out signature. It occurred to me then that someone had not wanted Mallory's borrowing recorded. Whether the reason was innocent or damning remained an open question, but the gesture itself possessed a quiet deliberateness I could not dismiss. As we stepped into the corridor, Lewis asked whether I believed her account. I told him the truth as I understood it, that belief was not the currency in which these early moments dealt. What mattered was the tension between her poised exterior and the slight fissures beneath it. Those fissures rarely lied, even when their owners meant to. Outside, the clouds pressed low over the spires, and a faint drizzle softened the outline of the Radcliffe camera. I felt again that hush from earlier in the quadrangle, the sense of some silent negotiation between the visible and the hidden. Reeves remained in the room behind us, a solitary figure among the books, but her presence echoed with a subtle disquiet that followed me down the stairwell like an unanswered question. Halfway to the street, I remembered the crossword in Mallory's room, the unfilled word hinting at betrayal. I wondered then whether the clue belonged only to Mallory's puzzle, or whether the pattern extended further, threading quietly through the conversations of the living. Oxford keeps such patterns well. There are moments in an investigation when the world seems to tilt by a single, almost imperceptible degree, and suddenly the familiar becomes faintly untrustworthy. For me, that moment arrived in Mallory's rooms later that afternoon, when Lewis, with his habitual care not to disturb anything he did not understand, reached behind a row of books and withdrew the photograph. He handed it to me with the quiet caution one reserves for a relic or a wound. It was the kind of college photograph that pretended to be informal while arranging everyone with deliberate symmetry, blurred faces at a garden gathering, a table set beneath soft greenery, sunlight caught in the necks of wine bottles. But it was the center of the picture that held me. Mallory, perhaps 20 years younger, gazed not at the camera, but at the woman beside him, and she, holding a porcelain teacup indistinguishable from the one I had seen cooling in the Quadrangle, looked back at him with an expression that was neither affection nor indifference, but something more complicated, something careful. There was no annotation on the back, no date, no initials. And for a man who annotated everything, who wrote his life into margins as though terrified of being misunderstood after death, that silence felt strangely deliberate. Lewis asked whether she might be a former colleague. I murmured something not committal, though I found myself staring at the image with the same uneasy curiosity with which I might consider a crossword clue whose answer hovered just outside reach. The woman's face had the kind of quiet attentiveness one sees in people accustomed to listening more than they speak. But there was something guarded in the way her hand enclosed the cup, as though she feared someone might take it from her. We left the photograph where we found it, though I felt its weight still resting in my thoughts as we walked downstairs to speak with Dr. Simon Clark. Clark possessed that cultivated confidence one finds among younger fellows who have risen quickly and expect to rise further. His handshake was firm, his smile immediate, yet there was an agitation beneath the surface, an eagerness that strained against his effort to appear composed. He offered us tea, though neither of us wished for it, and spoke of Mallory with the kind of brittle admiration that is offered when envy has learned to dress itself with courtesy. Mallory was brilliant, Clark said, but self-destructive. A man who chased historical ghosts at the expense of living colleagues. Clark's eyes flicked too often toward the shelves, as though searching for an anchor or an escape. When I asked where he had been the previous evening, he recited his movements with suspicious ease, as though he had practiced the sequence for an audience he feared would doubt him. He mentioned a departmental dinner. He mentioned a brief conversation with Reeves about lecture timetables. His hand tightened slightly on his teacup when he spoke her name. Such gestures are rarely meaningless. A small deduction formed, then not a conclusion, only a faint tremor of insight. Clark had known about Mallory's archival project before it became public. The way he referred to Mallory's research hinted at familiarity deeper than casual academic discussion. He corrected himself mid-sentence when he almost used a title from the manuscript we found on Mallory's desk manuscript Clark should not have seen. He recovered quickly, but not before the truth flickered across his expression like a reflection in a window at dusk. Lewis, perceptive in ways he rarely credited himself for, caught it too. Outside in the hallway, he remarked that Clark seemed unusually nervous for a man who insisted he had nothing to hide. I agreed, though not entirely. Clark's nervousness was not the tremor of guilt, but the unease of someone who has realized too late how far he has drifted from honesty. We returned to Mallory's rooms once more before leaving the college. The photograph lay where we had replaced it, face down now, as though reluctant to meet anyone's gaze. I turned it over, again studying the woman's eyes. There was no sign of the warden in the image, nor Reeves, nor Clark. Only Mallory and that unknown woman, standing close in a way that suggested they shared some history the rest of the world had either forgotten or never learned. A breeze drifted through the window, carrying with it the distant toll of a bell from Magdalen. I looked at the woman's teacup once more, its rim marked by the same faint pattern as the cup abandoned in the quadrangle, and I felt again that subtle tilt in the air, that shift that precedes understanding but does not yet grant it. We locked the room behind us, though it felt as though Mallory's life remained unlocked, its pages fluttering in unexplained drafts. And somewhere in the silence between steps, I sensed that the photograph held an answer. If only I could decipher the question. The call came just after lunch, when the sky had sunk into that pale, indifferent color that makes Oxford appear older than its centuries. A solicitor, whose voice sounded too smooth to trust, informed us that Mallory had altered his will a fortnight before his disappearance. A small adjustment, he said, barely worth comment, though his tone suggested otherwise. A bequest of manuscripts nothing of great monetary value to someone unnamed. The phrasing was peculiar enough to draw me from the lethargy that sometimes settles after hours of administrative tedium. Lewis and I walked to the firm's office near St. Aldate's, the pavements slick with earlier rain, carrying the faint scent of cold stone and bicycle oil. Inside, the air held the hush of legal caution, softened by the smell of old books and polished wood. The solicitor, a man with the polished manners of someone who believed himself immune to surprise, handed me a copy of the amendment. The wording was spare, almost severe manuscripts to be entrusted to the individual entitled to the truth. Not a name, not even initials, just a shadow of intention. I asked whether Mallory had given any clarification, but the solicitor merely shook his head. Mallory had been unusually tense, he said, though not in a way that invited questions. He had left abruptly after signing, as though eager to outrun his own decision. As we stepped back onto the street, Lewis asked what sort of truth would warrant such ambiguity. I muttered that truth was rarely simple in academic circles, and even less so when tethered to inheritance. A memory returned to me, then the faded diary page missing from the college archives. Mallory had been translating fragments connected to an expulsion from the 17th century, a scandal no one wished to mention out loud. It struck me that the request might not have been for a person but for a purpose, the restoration of something long concealed. When we returned to All Souls, the warden greeted us with that polished courtesy he seemed to deploy most easily when he felt cornered. He claimed no knowledge of the will, and his surprise was a shade too practiced to pass without notice. He assured us the college had nothing to hide. His voice betrayed him on the last word, the faintest tremor, like a man stepping onto ice he hopes is thick enough to bear his weight. I asked whether Mallory had quarreled with anyone recently. The warden's answer drifted through a cloud of qualifications, finally coming to rest on the suggestion that Mallory had been overwrought. Something about ancient grievances, he said, waving a hand as though brushing away cobwebs. It was the gesture rather than the words that caught me a reflexive dismissal, too quick, too eager to close the matter. We left the lodge and crossed the quad, our footsteps muted by the damp stones. I found myself drawn again to the eastern bench, where the teacup had sat that morning. It was gone now, retrieved by some practical hand, leaving only a faint ring of moisture like the ghost of a quiet confession. I wondered whether Mallory had once sat there, wrestling with the decision to alter his will. Back in Mallory's rooms, I searched his desk once more. Lewis examined the bookshelves, finding little beyond the familiar disorder of scholarship, but in the drawer beneath the manuscripts lay a scrap of paper torn from a larger sheet. A single word had been written there, just one, but crossed out so forcefully that the paper had begun to fray. Betrayal. The same word suggested by the crossword clue he had left unfinished. A man does not cross out a word like that without feeling its weight. Lewis asked whether we should consider Reeves or Clark as possible recipients of the mysterious bequest. I told him that the absence of a name was more interesting than any name that might have been written there. Mallory had trusted someone without trusting them enough to identify them, or perhaps he had feared identifying them at all. As we left the rooms, the air grew colder, the corridor stretching ahead like a stone corridor in an old church. The college seemed to retreat into itself, as though guarding the secret Mallory had died, or perhaps killed, to protect. I could not shake the sensation that the truth he meant to leave behind had already slipped from one set of hands into another, and somewhere between those hands lay the reason he would never finish his crossword. I've never cared for the way news travels through Oxford. It moves with neither haste nor compassion, sliding instead along the unseen corridors of curiosity until it settles, almost elegantly, at one's feet. That afternoon, as Lewis and I crossed the quad toward the cloisters, I felt the shift in the air before we reached the staircase. A porter, pale and stiffly composed, waited at the entrance like a man unwilling to descend again into the knowledge he had found. The basement cloister smelled of damp stone and faintly of extinguished candles, though no candles had been lit there for years. We stepped past stacked chairs, their metal legs angled like forgotten limbs, and into the narrow alcove where Mallory lay. His body had been arranged with the indifference of accident, yet the scene lacked the disorder that accident usually leaves behind. His head rested at an unnatural angle, the hair darkened with a small but decisive smear of dried blood. His watch, still clasped around his wrist, had stopped at 4:17. Lewis crouched beside him, speaking in low tones more for his own steadiness than mine. I let the silence settle a moment longer than necessary, the air thick with that peculiar sadness I've always felt in the presence of the newly dead. Mallory's glasses lay several feet away, folded neatly, as though removed by a careful hand. That detail struck me first. No man falls, strikes his head, and then tidies his spectacles. I asked the porter who had found him. A junior fellow, he said, though the man himself could not yet bring himself to speak. I could imagine the scene well enough. A scholar descending for some forgotten chair or mislaid book, only to discover a colleague sprawled as though dropped from the ceiling. Death in Oxford has a way of staining the air. Lewis examined the floor, murmuring about the absence of disturbance. No overturned chair, no shuffled marks, no sign of defensive movement. I said quietly that the blood on Mallory's head was too clean, the wound too neat. A single blow, perhaps, but delivered at a height that suggested intention rather than chance. Lewis frowned, tracing the possibilities, and I saw in his expression the moment he understood that our search had shifted from disappearance to murder. The warden arrived shortly after, breathless despite his attempts to appear controlled. His gaze lingered on Mallory's body with a mixture of sorrow and irritation, as though the man had committed some final administrative inconvenience. He asked when we would remove him, and I felt an old impatience rise within me. We would remove him, I said, when we understood where he had died. The warden blinked at that. Somewhere in his eyes I glimpsed a subtle fear that the truth might reach too far backward. We examined the basement carefully, though the room offered little. The window had been latched from the inside. The door showed no signs of forced entry. Mallory's pockets held only his keys, a folded scrap of paper, and a train ticket stub from 2 days earlier. The paper was blank, except for the faint indentation of erased writing. I held it up to the dim light, trying to coax meaning from the grooves, but whatever had once been written, there had been removed with determined finality. When the body was taken away, Lewis and I remained a while longer. There was a stillness in the cloister that felt almost reverential, as though the room understood it had become a witness. I found myself pacing in a narrow circle, listening to the soft echo of my own footsteps. At one point, my heel clicked sharply against the stone, and I noticed a small smear, no larger than an eyelash, a faint line of clay-colored dust that did not match the flooring. Someone had stepped there so recently. As we climbed the stairs, Lewis asked about the time of death. I told him watches seldom stop at the truth, they stop where they are made to. Mallory could have died at any hour before the basement had been entered. The cloister had no clock, no wandering witnesses, only shadow and stone, a perfect place for a secret to be arranged. Outside, the weak afternoon light brushed the quad, washing the ancient walls in colorless calm. Students crossed in small clusters, unaware of the history quietly shifting beneath their feet. The world continued its ordinary rhythm, indifferent to the wound hidden below. Lewis asked whether the body's placement suggested a message. I said I did not yet know. But the solitary bruise, the folded glasses, the careful arrangement, they hinted at someone who wished the scene to be interpreted, perhaps even misinterpreted, a gesture constructed with precision. As we walked away, I felt again the memory of the abandoned teacup, cooling slowly, unnoticed at first, a small, quiet herald of the violence we now understood too late. Oxford vibrated with secrets, and Mallory's death had just become one of its darker chords. It is a peculiar habit of mine, though I have never admitted it willingly, to listen more intently when people believe they're telling the truth. Lies, after all, are rehearsed. Truth exposes itself with the careless ease of someone removing a coat in an overheated room. That evening, as Lewis and I retraced the timeline of the previous day, I felt the rhythm of the case shift in a way that made the air grow thinner around us. We began with Reeves. She received us in her office, a narrow space crowded with books whose spines had softened with age and handling. She sat with her hands folded too neatly, as though afraid they might betray her. She repeated her earlier account with pointed precision. She had been in the upper reading room from very early morning, preparing notes. She had left only once for tea, though she could not recall the exact hour. Her voice carried the controlled clarity of someone balancing on the edge of certainty, hoping no one noticed the tremor beneath. Yet the porter insisted the reading room door had remained locked until well after 7, and even the most diligent scholar cannot enter a room that refuses her. When I mentioned this, Reeves paused just a fraction too long and adjusted her glasses as though a mote of dust had suddenly become intolerable. I watched the gesture with quiet interest. People do not lie solely with words, they lie with interruptions in their natural rhythm. Lewis asked whether Mallory had seemed distressed in their last conversation. Reeves stared at her desk, tracing some invisible pattern on its surface, and replied that all scholars suffered bouts of anxiety. It was a response chosen for its convenience rather than its insight. I felt the faint prickling at the edge of deduction, the sense that she was withholding something not out of malice but fear. We left her to the dimming light that filtered through her window and made our way to Clark, whose confidence had not improved in the intervening hours. He greeted us with a forced warmth, offering tea again, though he could not disguise the twitch of his fingers against the saucer. His account differed from Reeves's in several small but crucial ways, as though the two of them had prepared their statements separately but not compared notes. Clark insisted he had spoken with Reeves the previous evening, not about timetables as he had claimed earlier, but about the upcoming review of the fellowship posts. He added details on names, dates, passing remarks that felt suspiciously like embellishments. People who speak the truth rarely decorate it. People who lie rarely resist. Lewis asked directly whether Clark had known about Mallory's archival research. Clark hesitated, then adopted a tone of casual familiarity, claiming he had only heard vague rumors. But the tone did not match the content. The words sagged under the weight of effort. I reminded him gently of his earlier slip, the reference to a phrase found only in Mallory's manuscript. Clark flushed, a quick red blooming at his collar, and muttered something about overhearing it in conversation. It was not convincing, but neither was it fully false. A half-truth, perhaps. Those are always the most treacherous. As we stepped back into the corridor, Lewis remarked that the two accounts, placed side by side, resembled mismatched pages from different books. He asked which one seemed more likely to contain the truth. I said quietly that truth rarely sits in the center. It hides in the inconsistent margins. It was the inconsistencies I cared about, not the stories themselves. We returned to the quad, where the after-rain air carried the scent of damp earth and cooling stone. A breeze moved across the grass, lifting a few leaves in a half-hearted spiral. I found my eyes drawn to Mallory's staircase window, dark now, the curtains motionless. Somewhere behind that stillness, the threads of deceit were beginning to separate. A new thought struck me then, subtle as the shifting of a shadow in the photograph we had found earlier. The woman holding the teacup. Reeves had said nothing of knowing Mallory socially, yet her earlier reaction to the photograph's fleeting tightness in her posture seemed to return with sudden clarity. She had recognized something, or someone. Lewis asked what troubled me. I told him it was nothing, which was almost true. What troubled me was not the photograph or the two conflicting stories, but the sense that the lies formed a pattern too deliberate to be an accident. As we crossed beneath the old archway, the stone above us gleamed with the last of the day's moisture. Two stories that refused to align. And between them, somewhere quiet and small, lay the truth waiting for the moment we would finally stop believing the things we were being told. Even now, when I think back on that evening, I can still feel the faint pressure of the air in Mallory's rooms, as though the place itself wished to confide something but had not yet found its voice. Lewis and I had returned there after dusk, hoping that the softening of the light might reveal what the harsher hours of the day had concealed. I've always believed that certain truths prefer the twilight. They seem less startled there, more willing to step forward. Mallory's manuscript lay open where we had left it, its pages ruffled by a draught neither of us could locate. A single lamp cast a pale amber glow across the desk, illuminating the superimposed layers of his final work translations, crossed with annotations, fragments of poetry beside historical citations, the peculiar order that only a restless mind understands. It was there, in the margin of a page devoted to the diary of that long-dead fellow, that I noticed the line again, the misquoted "Don." I had seen it days earlier, but its significance, faint as the first vibration of a distant bell, had only now begun to resonate. Mallory, meticulous to the point of irritation, would never have allowed such an error to stand. And yet here it was, written in his own rounded hand, but with the unsettling sense of something grafted onto his scholarship. I leaned closer, tracing the edge of the ink with a fingertip. It had been written quickly, perhaps after argument or interruption, the pressure uneven, the pen lifted abruptly at the end of the line. Lewis, noticing my attention, asked whether it mattered. I told him it did, though I could not yet say why. Poems, misquoted, leave trails, and trails often lead back to the mouth that uttered them. I remembered the earlier conversation with Reeves. She had quoted Dawn too, but imperfectly, her voice faltering just slightly on the very phrase now before me. She had recovered with studied poise, yet I had detected that quiet jolt beneath her composure, the shock of hearing one's own mistake reflected elsewhere. Clark, meanwhile, had used the same line, but with the swagger of a man who believed misquotation charming rather than careless. I had dismissed it earlier as arrogance. Now I wondered whether it revealed something more deliberate, a shared error, a shared conversation, or a shared alibi disguised as scholarship. We left the manuscript and walked into the corridor, the boards creaking beneath our steps like old memories resisting disturbance. The college was nearly silent at that hour. Somewhere above us, a door clicked shut with a softness that suggested someone leaving a room they preferred not to admit having entered. Lewis glanced upward, but the sound dissolved into the hush of the old staircase before we could place it. Outside, the quad lay under a thin mist, the lamps casting hesitant circles of light. We crossed toward the Fellows Building, where Reeves had been working late. She welcomed us with a restraint that did not fully mask her unease. Her office had the stale warmth of a room inhabited for too many hours, the air thick with the scent of old paper and extinguished tea. She asked whether there had been news. I told her that Mallory's manuscripts raised questions. She looked away then, only briefly, but long enough for doubt to curl at the edge of her stillness. I mentioned the misquoted dawn. She breathed in, a small, almost imperceptible intake, and replied that scholars often take liberties with poetry. The remark was too light, too swift, like a stone skimmed across water to distract from the depth beneath. She gestured at her notes, muttering something about preparations for her lecture, but her hand wavered slightly as she moved a book aside. The tremor was faint, yet unmistakable. As we left her office, Lewis murmured that she seemed troubled. I said that troubled people often reveal more than calm ones. The misquotation had unsettled her. Whether from guilt, grief, or some darker recognition, I could not yet know. We next sought Clark, who received us in his rooms with breathless cheerfulness that struck me as oddly rehearsed. When I asked whether he had ever discussed Dawn with Mallory, he offered a rambling account of a conversation over wine weeks earlier. Yet the details contradicted themselves, first in the hall, then in Reeves's office, then somewhere along the gardens. His words wandered like a man walking in fog, hoping we would not notice the absence of ground beneath his steps. When we returned to the quad, the mist had thickened, wrapping the college in a quiet that felt almost accusatory. I found myself thinking again of that single line of poetry, repeated by 3 different mouths, each with its own inflection. A misquoted poet echoing through conversations that now seemed woven together by threads none of them wished us to tug. Some truths arrive softly. Others drift toward you like a voice in the dusk, familiar enough to trust, unsettling enough to follow. I've often thought that the most revealing objects in an investigation are not the ones placed in plain sight, but the ones tucked away with a kind of guilty reverence, as though their owners feared the consequences of forgetting, yet dreaded the consequences of remembering. It was Lewis who found the diary page, though I suspect he would insist the credit belongs to chance. But chance has never impressed me much. It behaves too much like an intention disguised as an accident. We had returned to the Bodleian that morning, the sky outside trapped in a dull gray that made the library windows appear bruised. The manuscripts Mallory had been working on lay untouched since our last visit, and I felt again that slight tremor of reluctance whenever I entered his intellectual territory. Scholarship has a way of haunting the rooms it inhabits, and Mallory's mind lingered here with a persistence I could not shake. Lewis was rifling through a stack of modern texts that had been unhelpfully piled near the older materials. He muttered that Mallory must have been reading something unrelated to his project when he paused, his fingers resting on a spine with unusual hesitation. He withdrew the book, a rather dry treatise on cryptographic patterns, and shook it gently. A single, brittle page fluttered out and lodged itself against his shoe. Even before I bent to pick it up, I recognized the texture of 17th-century paper, soft-edged from handling, the ink faded to a faint sepia. The handwriting was the cramped, fervent script characteristic of the diarist Mallory had been studying. But it was the top of the page that provoked a jolt. The torn edge was uneven, jagged, as though ripped once and then torn again to alter its shape. Someone had not merely removed it, someone had reshaped it. I held it beneath the weak lamp, reading the words with a kind of reluctant hunger. It described, in veiled and pained detail, the expulsion of a fellow whose name had been scratched out with violent strokes. The account hinted at impropriety, though the nature of the crime was left maddeningly vague. What caught my eye, however, was the marginalia, a faint note in Mallory's unmistakable hand, questioning whether the expulsion had been concealed intentionally. I felt Lewis watching me, waiting for some pronouncement I did not yet trust myself to make. The diary page was not merely missing, it had been deliberately obscured. Its absence mattered not only to Mallory's research, but to someone living. Someone who feared what the truth implied. We carried the page back to All Souls, the crisp air sharpening as we crossed the quad. I felt the familiar pull of the place, the deceptive serenity of old stone, the muffled footsteps of students, the sense that history pressed its palm against every window. Reeves's office was dark, though I noticed her coat missing from its usual hook. Clark's room, too, was empty, papers scattered in a mild disarray that could have been carelessness or anxious tidying. Lewis remarked that the warden's door was open, and I followed him inside. The warden looked up with the startled annoyance of a man interrupted mid-rumination. I placed the diary page on his desk and watched the color drain, very slightly, from his face. He recovered quickly, but not quickly enough. He said that Mallory must have removed it for his own convenience. His voice betrayed the lie, even as he shaped it. I asked whether the college had reason to fear the resurfacing of an old scandal. The warden's fingers tightened around the edge of his chair. He mumbled something about the unreliability of 17th century accounts, their tendency toward melodrama. Yet the tremor in his hand told me the scandal was neither forgotten nor forgiven. Lewis examined the bookshelves while I pressed gently at the seams of the warden's evasions. At some point, he called my name with a quiet urgency. He had found the missing manuscript volume, the one Mallory had last borrowed, wedged behind a row of irrelevant texts. Its pages had been disturbed recently, the dust unsettled. Someone had searched it after Mallory's death. When we stepped outside again, the air felt heavier, weighted with the knowledge that the past had been cut and recut to suit the present. The diary page had been torn twice, once in its own century, once in ours. Each tear marked by fear, each tear hiding a truth no one wished to name. As we walked toward the gate, Lewis asked what the page meant. I told him the meaning was not in the words, but in the hands that had tried so hard to erase them. Hands, I suspected, belonged not only to Mallory's enemies, but perhaps to his allies as well. Secrets, like paper, become more fragile each time they are torn. There are endings one anticipates with a kind of grim patience, and others that descend quietly, like dusk settling over the spires. Mallory's death had circled us for days, drawing nearer in slow increments, and by the time the final pieces arranged themselves, I felt less the satisfaction of understanding than the muted ache of inevitability. Oxford rarely grants revelations without exacting something in return. The morning had begun with a drizzle fine enough to seem imaginary, a mist that softened the stone and made the colleges appear half asleep. Lewis and I walked across the quad toward the hall where Reeves waited, summoned not by force but by exhaustion. I sensed it in the way she sat, hands clasped in her lap, eyes fixed on some private horizon. A woman who had spent too long holding her breath. She did not speak at first. The quiet stretched, not uncomfortably, but with the heaviness of truth nearing the point where it can no longer be borne in silence. When she finally began, her voice felt like the memory of a confession rather than the confession itself. She described a quarrel with Mallory, not an argument of academic footnotes or citations, but one rooted in fear. Mallory had discovered something about Clark's involvement with the archives, something Clark had tried and failed to bury. Reeves had tried to intercede, to calm him, to protect a man she cared for more than she wished to admit. I listened without interruption, absorbing not the words but the spaces between them. In those spaces lay the shape of the truth. The meeting in the cloister, the raised voices, the moment of frustration that slipped too quickly into violence. A push, not meant to injure. A fall, horribly final. And afterward, the panic. Clark arrives moments later, the two of them dragging Mallory's body into the basement alcove, arranging it with trembling hands, removing the glasses so the scene might appear accidental. A performance built from desperation. What struck me most was Reeves's description of the teacup. She had brought it with her that morning, an ordinary gesture, a small solace against the cold. After the fall, in her terror, she had left it behind on the bench in the Quadrangle, forgotten in the shadow of a death she had never intended to cause. When I found it that dawn, its steam fading into the air, I sensed something was wrong without knowing what shape the wrongness held. The cooling teacup had been the case's first whisper, a quiet herald of the truth now unraveled before me. Lewis asked her why she had not come forward sooner. She answered with a weary honesty, because she had believed the truth would destroy more lives than it mended. Clark's career, her own reputation, the college's carefully guarded history, and because guilt clouds judgment with its own logic. Clark entered soon after, his face pale, his confidence stripped away. Reeves's confession had undone him completely. He admitted to helping her hide the body, though his voice carried more sorrow than defiance. He insisted the initial fall had been accidental, that Mallory's death was the tragic outcome of a momentary lapse. Perhaps it was, perhaps not. Even now, I'm not entirely certain where the accident ends and the intention begins. When the formalities concluded and the two of them were escorted away, the hall felt suddenly cavernous, its silence too large to inhabit comfortably. Lewis rested a hand briefly on my shoulder, a gesture of camaraderie that required no words. He left me standing there, the echo of our footsteps fading into the old wood. I stepped outside into the early evening light, the drizzle now a fine mist that clung to my coat. The bench along the eastern wall waited, empty once more. I approached it slowly, as though paying my respects to a witness long overlooked. There was no trace of the cup now, only a faint circular mark on the stone, like an old scar softened by time. I sat for a moment, listening to the muted hum of the city beyond the college walls. The air smelled of wet leaves and something else, perhaps regret, though I have never trusted my ability to distinguish one form of sadness from another. The truth had been uncovered, yes, but uncovered truths are rarely triumphant. They lie quietly in the open, stripped of their mystery, and what remains is often something more painful than ignorance. Reeves's weary eyes, Clark's trembling hands, Mallory's unfinished manuscriptal of it swirled together in a melancholy I could not easily disperse. As I rose to leave, the wind shifted slightly, carrying with it the faint toll of a distant bell. I wondered, not for the first time, whether Oxford keeps its secrets, or whether it merely waits for someone foolish enough to hope for their truth. And somewhere behind me, in the quiet hollow of memory, the teacup cooled again,